Hello and good afternoon. We are here to discuss what happens to those living in conflict zones of the country. There's Kashmir, there's Northeast, the Naxal belts, the tribal belts. What happens to the women, the children, the young who are living, surviving, somehow surviving in those areas? And for the discussion on this, we have four well-known authors, and they will be speaking for 5 minutes each so that we can have an interactive session. The audience can ask them, and it's very important that they give what they have seen and heard and written right on route about the ground realities. I mean, they've been there, they've been traveling, and then you can just ask them. So we start right away. We have with us Barkha Dutt and Jasmina. She has covered, she was at Belgrade covering the war, and she's done a book on what effect it had on the children and the women. And we have Rashmi Saksena, and then we have Paro Anand. So, yeah. Okay. So we start right away, and just 5 minutes each. So we start with Barkha, you? Yeah.
Hi everyone, you can hear me at the back? Okay. I won't take 5 minutes, I'll just take a couple of minutes to talk about what I understand from the theme. Women in conflict to me has two dimensions. One are how conflicts impact women, and two is what happens to women reporting on conflict. I think both are actually quite critical to what we're talking about, because I do believe, much as I am uncomfortable with most gender generalizations, I do believe that women cover conflict differently from how men do. Just to give you a little bit of background, my mother, who actually worked with Rashmi, so I've known Rashmi since I was for many, many years. My mother brought us up with stories of how she covered the first war between India and Pakistan in 1965. A lot of people think that I was the first woman to go and cover a major war, but it was actually my mother, Prabha Dutt, who died when I was about 13 years old. But it has an interesting backstory to it, and the backstory is that having already had to fight like many women of her generation to get what was regarded as hard news stories, when she wanted to go and cover the war, her editor said, "We cannot send a woman into this space, it's too dangerous." So she said, "If you're not going to let me cover this war, then I may as well take a vacation." So she actually had a cousin in the army. She took a notepad and pen, called this cousin, and went to the Punjab frontline alone and started sending dispatches back. And that's how, in fact, women started reporting war in this country. But what is ironic is about 3 decades later, when I wanted to go and report on the Kargil war, and you would have thought that this debate would have been settled once and for all about having women reporting from the front line. It took me a really long time to convince people to let me into that space. And this was almost like, that was 65 and this was 99. And here we were still trying to say, let us report this war. And there was another woman at the front, Harinder Baveja, I should mention her as well, in Kargil. I don't know what experience she had, but I found it very, very difficult to convince the military at first. And the reasons they came up with, they said, "Oh, we can't provide special treatment." And I was like, "Why do you think we need special treatment?" They said, "Well, there won't be separate bathrooms, right? For example." And I said, "That's totally fair. What makes you think we can't go under a tree or behind a rock just like the guys?" And so on. It was very difficult, but I think once it happened, I think the army was satisfied that it was the correct decision. And now we're actually talking about letting women into combat. And I think at that time we were still fighting for the rights of women to report on conflict. So one part of the conversation I hope today will be what happens when women report on conflict. The other thing that I have seen very closely, because I've spent about 2 decades reporting from Kashmir, is the impact of conflict on women. And I think what I've seen is that women are left holding the debris, as it were, the debris that conflict leaves behind, the destruction. They are left to be the most scarred. The people who have to build homes again on the debris of conflict it's not that women don't have political opinions, or, for example, if you look at a conflict zone like Kashmir today, actually I have seen in 20 years, women go from being grief-stricken to actually now you have women at the first tier of very, very aggressive street protests wherein the militaries had to readapt their strategy because to deal with male protesters in their minds and to deal with female protesters in their mind is entirely, different. And how many of you have seen this serial called Bodyguard on Netflix? Anyone? So I don't want to give away the story, but one of the things that that serial deals with is the stereotypical assumption that women in conflict zones are only victims. Women in conflict zones are not only victims. Women in conflict zones they are victims and participants both simultaneously often. They are often at the first tier of rebellion, protest, anger, and they also force establishments to readapt strategies. So I think what I would like to talk about as we open this up, I'll just make this preliminary remarks, is to structure this conversation into my experience as a woman reporting conflict and what I have seen in these conflict zones in terms of what happens to women, the assumption that women don't pick up arms, the assumption that women are not part of violent conspiracies. This is untrue. This is as much of a stereotype as we apply to all other spaces. So I'll end with that. Thank you.
Thanks, Barkha.
Me?
Yeah, Jasmina.
Okay, so I'm the foreigner here, but I, I spoke yesterday about my book, and I'm a writer actually, so I wrote not one book, I wrote many books, on this topic. I didn't want to do. I was a fantasy writer until the war started. So I will start with this true episode that happens. In Serbia, where I lived in Belgrade at the time the war exploded, we had only men were drafted. And I was sitting, and they were like drafted really during the night, like really in a bad way. Nobody really wanted to fight that war outside of the country, outside of the limits, outside of the border. It was ridiculous. People were feeling something bad about it, something not right, fighting a war against your brother's family outside your border, because it was called a patriotic war, but, to defend your home. But if you defend your home, which is not in your country, what kind of home is that? There was something wrong about it. So the true episode was that I was sitting with other two men and another woman. So there were two women and the two couples, sitting at the table. And the police came with the army police. So this is the way they were drafting people. They come, immediately say your name, and they take you away immediately. So when they came there, I was like, why do you only ask ID for men? What about me? Because I was trying to, I had a feminist reaction first, not the pacifist. I'm ashamed of it. Today I'm ashamed of it. So they say, but you're only a woman. You don't count. And I said, what do you mean I don't count? If it's a real patriotic war, I count. I can say yes, I can say no. In the meantime, of course, I was protecting these two men and who ran away from the table. And the consequence is that in Belgrade, where I come from, 80% of men who were supposed to be drafted were war deserters. They couldn't even arrest them because it would be full. It was a massive civilian disobedience. And we women were 90% organizers of the pacific protests, starting from deserters and hiding the men, up to, organizing demos. This is the group I'm standing in front of, which is Women in Black from Belgrade. It's an international group, but we were, at the time, Women in Black from Belgrade. We did pacifist protests in front of the military, in front of the tanks, in front of everybody necessary, and it grew up to 1 million people who were following us or whatever, inventing their own pacifist movement. So I wanted to tell you that these brave women who were I would say that men were so traumatized and they had to hide, and that all these jobs had to be done by women. And some were more brave, some were less brave, but everybody became brave after a certain time, after the everyday life collapsed and there was no food, no medicines, we all had to do something about our life. And I will just tell you that the big consequence of this movement of women is that rape was for the first time criminalized in war, in the Hague International War Crime Tribunal. Never ever before it was criminalized. It was considered as some kind of secondary thing that happens during the war, so what? Now it's considered torture, or it's considered war, crime against humanity. And one Another beautiful consequence is that we had International Women's War Tribunal in Sarajevo 2-3 years ago, when these women who were considered victims. I hate the word victims because they just were, let's say, they were the object of somebody else's violence. I don't want to have this image of a victim if something happens to me by somebody else being violent. Anyway, they came out and they testified in front of everybody, in front of the court, in front of the lawyers, in front of you. You know, it was a huge audience for the first time in history. They testified. And thanks to that, this kind of testimonies, indictments were put up, and there is a history to it. It's not the first women's war tribunal. There is one that existed before, you know, but it's the first one in Europe, and we shouldn't forget it.
Okay, thanks. Sir. Now is Rashmi. You have your mic. Okay.
Hello, can you hear me? Is this okay? Okay. This tone has been set by the two earlier. Can't? Yeah. Is it all?
Just be a little near her.
So, taking off from the point that what happens to people who are in conflict zones. And what I realized was that one of the major things that happen, now I'm talking in the context of women, is that they themselves become perpetrators of violence, which I find a bit difficult to digest, considering I feel that women are not born to be violent or to actually take up the gun and kill in cold blood. So when I started doing this book, I had heard while I was reporting, I've been now reporting for 48 years, elections, famine, flood, there was always this reference to women who had gone into insurgency or were even in Kashmir, that they were sort of what they called overground workers. But then that was not my story of the day, and I didn't follow it. Many years later, I decided to start writing and researching on these women. And my first question in my mind was, why? Why does it happen that these women take up the gun? Or they take up a life which is so risky and so different from what they have been used to in their own social milieu. And I have to confess, I started with the assumption, which we all hate to use, is the word victim. I thought these women were actually victims in the sense, and this is what a lot of government agencies had been telling me, oh, it's not ideology, it's nothing. They are forced into this life. They are either sexually exploited or they have been kidnapped, and they've therefore now joined these movements. When I started to meet these women, I realized, no, victim was definitely the wrong word for them. These women were women who knew exactly what they were doing. They had various reasons for going into these movements, and I can tell you that it had very little to do with being kidnapped or sexually exploited, even once they were there, and also what brought them into these movements. Now, there's one point that a lot of all this is nuanced and differs from region to region. Kashmir is totally different. Chhattisgarh is different. When you go into the states of the Northeast, when you're looking at Manipur, you're looking at Nagaland, and the Ulfa movement in Assam, and the Bodo movement, you know, the mindset is a bit different. And I think it's impacted by the social and cultural factors that influence their life, where they have been living. Now in Kashmir, they don't have the sort of status which women cadres have in the other movements. And, you know, we were, at least in North India, so focused on Kashmir, we tend to forget what's happening in Manipur or what's happening in Nagaland or even Assam for that matter. There are as much conflict zones as Kashmir is, you know. And the women there have been in these movements even as early as the 80s. And Nagaland even before. One of the women mentioned in my book was in the first batch of people who trekked for 8 months to China to get arms training. So you have all these stories. Somewhere it's ideology, somewhere it is their commitment to jihad, as we see in Kashmir. And in Chhattisgarh, it's more like, they come from the tribal belt and they have a very free life. They take decisions on their own. And for them, it's just, going into the movement to be away from the daily routine which they've got bored with. But having said that, there is something which really propels these women. And what propels them is when they see what in their mind they feel is injustice to their men by the establishment. Now, that's a different question, whether it's right, wrong, that perception. But that perception in their mind that their men are being tortured by the establishment takes them into the absolute midst of this war. And the interesting part is that some of them train and turn out to be as lethal, or what should I say, trained cold-blooded killers. They also do a great job in keeping insurgency alive by being couriers of arms. They're very good at acting, at guise and guile, and they can find their way out of very ticklish situations. One of the women mentioned here, she carried out the biggest bank robbery ever in the history of Assam, to fund the Bodo movement. So, you have all these exploits. Kashmir is a very interesting story for me, because I also have the story of a woman who was amongst the first 5 women who crossed over to Pakistan for arms training, and her experience, which then decided that women didn't want to go for arms training because of the sort of exploitation they met. So again, it's the society they come from that decides their status. And also, the other point which I really want to make very clear is that these women, whether they are educated, not educated, but they take full responsibility of their actions. They don't want to be seen as, poor me, I have been pushed into this. They are very actually confident of what they've done, what they've not achieved, in their sense, what they call achievement, whether it's ideological or social or whatever. And all of them return to a normal life because they want to get married and have children. And therefore, they, I feel, become the largest constituency for peace. And I hope your questions will center around all this, and I'll be able to explain a little bit more. Thank you.
When I started in the late 80s, early 90s, working with young people in Kashmir, and here there's a little bit of shift from the rest of the panel. My work is basically with children and young people. When I started at that time, not one, and I'll repeat that, not one woman or young person were pro-violence. They all wanted peace. And they all wanted peace for one reason, because that was their futures were murky. They couldn't see the way ahead. That was the time when there were a lot of curfews, a lot of schools being closed, and mothers were wanting to get their children out of that murky future. So they were all the voice for peace, young people as well as women. Much later, sort of towards the end of the 90s, early 2000s, I was working with a group of young people, and some of them had their mothers there. And there were two very different voices that came up. One was a young Kashmiri Pandit boy who said to me, whenever I see an old Kashmiri, he used the word Kashmiri as though he himself was not Kashmiri. So there was a separation that had obviously happened. He said, whenever I see an old Kashmiri, I feel like killing him, because he has driven me out of my home, And he बड़े ठाट बाट से अपने घर में रह रहा है. And I'm a refugee in my own country. The second voice that I heard was this very naughty boy called Umar, who was about 11 or 12 years old. The naughtiest kid in that class. Or, you know, the kind that teachers say that, oh God, I have to go to this kid's class, because he was just always so disruptive. He went around to all of us who had gone there as part of a project to introduce the arts to these children. They were all orphans of terrorism. And he asked each of us, theater people, artists, writers, etc., इससे पैसे कैसे बनेंगे? How are we going to make money out of this? The truth was, you don't, right? So that was the honest answer we had to give him. And about 5 or 6 days into the 3-week program, Umar disappeared. And that's when we learned what his story was. His father had been killed when he was an infant. His mother had been thrown out of the house because that compensation was wanted by the family. So this child, an infant, lost both his parents in the space of a few days. He grew up with his dada and dadi. At 6 years old, he started school. And one day from school, he was kidnapped. He was very frightened. Turned out he was kidnapped by his mother, who had waited her time to be able to get her child back. She was working as a servant in people's homes, washing jhutha bartan, washing clothes, and sweeping. Umar was pained seeing his mother like that. He wanted to make money. He was picked up by a terrorist group, and as an 11-year-old, became a victim of terrorism by becoming a terrorist. And so some of my writing reflects young people's voices. More recently, after 2014-15, that voice has changed somewhat. As Rashmi mentioned, as the other speakers mentioned, women started taking a more proactive role. In my book, Weed, the woman throws her husband out of the house because he has taken the path of terrorism, and her instinct is to protect her sons by throwing the husband out, no matter what hardships she's going to have to face. But now that is changing. There are younger people, there are women who we have somehow failed because they who believed so strongly in non-violence are now on the path of violence very often. A similar kind of trajectory I've seen amongst nomadic tribals who I also work with and are in conflict situations of a different kind altogether, where at one time the women would beg us, please give us some land, koi thikana de do, somewhere where we can call our own, because there was nothing for them to call their own. But now there is more churning and therefore more violence, more frustration, that they are finding that maybe that is the only way. And I think that is the important part. We have to get through to women, to young people, to say that you don't have to follow that path, there is another way.
Okay, thank you. In fact, in the last couple of years, the conflict zones and areas are increasing. I mean, even in towns, you'll find little segments which can be termed conflict zones, even the highways where lynchings are taking place. So the whole expanse is in fact frightening. Yeah, the expanse is frightening. And I think we'll start the question answers, and you can one at a time, and you can mention that your questions are directed to which speaker. So we start straight away because as it is, we have limited time. Yeah, please. Mike, this mic. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everybody. So, my question is specially directed to Barkha Dutt. Ma'am, while we are talking about women who report from conflict zones, it's a shame that nobody has ever condemned the brutal mass gang rape of Kunan Poshpara by security forces. When it comes to Kashmir, why does this entire debate take a backseat? Why? Like why? Why no liberal in India has ever condemned the brutal mass rape of Kunan Poshpara? Why? Thank you.
So, thank you for your question. Are you able to hear me? Okay. Thank you for your question. I don't think that there should be competitive grieving or condemnation when it comes to any conflict zone, and that includes Jammu and Kashmir. Um, if there's one thing I have seen in the many years that I've been going there, that a life lost is breaking somebody's heart. A woman raped is having this same impact on that woman, irrespective of whether her ideology is separatist or with the Indian state. So I don't think this is about my grief and my massacre is worse or better than your grief or your massacre. If we talk about Kashmir in specific, I think I've already, I was not a reporter when this massacre that you reference happened, but certainly subsequently I have reported extensively, for example, on Kashmir's half widows as they're called. And these are women whose husbands went missing at the height of militancy. At that time it was suspected that they were picked up in the middle of the night by, shadowy groups that won't even identify themselves, right? And they were taken away, and for years these women never saw a body coming home. So they do not accept that their men have actually died. These were just civilians who went missing. So, and half widows are neither considered women whose husbands have died or been killed, nor are they considered, women whose husbands are alive and they live in this strange, horrible netherworld. They,
Half orphans as well.
and therefore half orphans as well. Then there is Parveen Ahangar, who is leading a group, mothers of missing persons. And she has been somebody I have interviewed repeatedly. And all I want to say is that, I find that as a journalist, we get caught in this sad sort of competition where if a soldier's wife is grieving, people who are of a certain ideology will grieve. If a separatist is killed and his wife is grieving, then you have to be of this ideology to grieve. And I think we need to, ideologies apart, you will have your ideology, I will have my ideology. At a human level, if we lose our empathy, if we lose our compassion for each other just because our politics are different, I think that is the real tragedy of conflict zones, and I think the media must reflect all shades of that truth. And I'll pass the mic on to someone else because I don't want to get into just a Kashmir discussion. I'm sure there are many other conflicts.
Yeah. Okay, this lady there. Yeah, please.
If it's also about Kashmir, then let's...
Please, you have a mic? You'll have to just come up then, please. Huh? Take the mic from him.
Hi, my name is Azmat and I'm from Kashmir. I don't want to make this discussion specifically about Kashmir, but this is a question that I want to ask all of you, especially to you, ma'am, because we are having a discussion around women in conflict zones, and as you just mentioned, Barkha, that it's ironic that in a conflict zone we start picking sides and we start taking sides when it comes to ideologies. Why is it that when all of you are talking about this conflict, except for you, I believe, everyone else on this panel, I feel that when they're talking about these women picking up arms, taking decisions in the state of being around a conflict, coming from a conflict zone, I can empathize with that situation a lot more. But I somehow feel that there's a connotation of, a certain kind of, you're kind of pointing fingers at her. You're questioning her choices. And the idea is that, she's making this choice. I mean, we're not able to empathize with her, but we're not saying she's doing something right or wrong, but there is a connotation of you pointing a finger towards her for taking that decision. Do you even understand? I mean, are you even actually empathizing with that woman in that situation? Are you even trying to understand where she's coming from? You just spoke about women in Kashmir being a part of the conflict because they're leaning towards jihadist ideologies coming from Kashmir. I mean, that's what you mentioned, the idea of jihad is what promotes a woman from Kashmir to be a part of the conflict. But that's not the case, to be very honest. I mean, we live every single day as a part of that conflict, and for us, it's not a choice that we make. It's not about being able to make that choice at all. We are forced into that situation because of factors that are not in our control. And then you cannot term that to be something that comes from a jihadist ideology, because that's definitely what that's not.
I know what I know what you mean. In fact, one cannot generalize. I know.
Absolutely. But my specific question...
No, actually, I think they were building up the backgrounders, why women are coming to the forefront. And to call anybody, I mean, who's in the forefront a jihadi, you cannot generalize.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I agree with that.
My specific question is, why is it that the narrative from your side, which should be absolutely impartial, looks like you're pointing a finger at that woman's
No,
choice?
I think you've taken it amiss. I feel because they work there and the ground realities are horrifying. I know, I cover Kashmir. I come back depressed. I mean, it's just sheer sorrow. There's nothing else, and there's anger. Obviously, is building up, and I think they were talking with the backgrounders because see, in the 5-minute talk, you cannot put in all your thoughts. So I feel that obviously, I mean, a woman, if she's up there fighting, she's compelled because of emotions.
I would request ma'am to answer why she specifically used those words, or why everyone on the panel has that kind of why are they pointing fingers?
Can I take this opportunity to say that maybe I've not been able to communicate properly what I wanted to say, but I said this in the context that when there is a conflict zone, women actually become violent and take to arms, which is a fallout of being in a conflict zone. And when I talked about jihad, was comparing the reasons for women in different geographical areas and insurgencies for getting into that movement. My book, if you do care to read, you will realize that I've tried completely not to be judgmental either about the politics or about the person. It's trying to actually fathom why women actually take up the arms. Why does it compel them? And one, whether you may accept it or no, but one of the reasons, as I pointed out, was that they feel, they have a perception that injustice is being done to their men. And the reason they justify that, the reason they've taken up arms and are now also killing, whichever way they are doing it, either by the gun or by some other method, whatever they employ, is what drives them. And my experience, I have worked extensively, not only for this book, but for other reportage in Kashmir, is in Kashmir, they always say that we don't know about the politics, but I'm helping my brother or my uncle or my son, whoever is in this movement, and for me, this is important. You may not agree with me, but you have to give me the liberty of being an author and writing what I've seen. Now, the same thing when you move to Chhattisgarh, they'll give you another reason for being in it. In Nagaland, it's completely different. In Manipur, I've also met women who say, this is business for me. I extort money and this is how I live. And I have to be with this organization to get that. My book doesn't point fingers at all. My book is trying to get into the minds of these women to find out why they go there, and when they return back to normal life because it's a quest for peace. That is what they actually want. Thank you.
The next question, please. Yeah.
Wing Commander Butt, ex-National Defense Academy. I've been in the war zone in Sri Lanka and Siachen Glacier. To answer this young lady also and to put it to the panel, it's not just about reading journalists, it's not about the internet, it's about having in your libraries military history, military geography, understanding very clearly intelligence. For example, I don't know how many of you here know that Churchill created Pakistan, and why did he create it? For the same reason that China is trying to go to Gwadar port, which Frederick the Great once wanted. So these are the core issues. Even in the Kashmir issue, I've fired rockets at Toshi Maidan, which is a beautiful place. I've composed some of my music in Kashmir. They're wonderful people. But the issues are, you can say, got aggravated from the ethnic cleansing backed by the ISI in the 1990s. And we can always hope for a federated Kashmir, provided the ISI and the drugs in Kashmir, in Afghanistan, which the even US Army tried to stop, but came back again, is done. Thank you. That is what I would like them to comment on.
Another question, please. Yeah.
So,
Yes, please.
all right, my question's more general to the panel. I think just following up of what the individual said before, how would you differentiate between justice and peace in conflict zones and understanding that there are structural consequences and factors that women have to deal with, and they're not often victims, but they're often faced with the most incredulous choices that are not choices. How do you distinguish?
Question is for who?
For the panel, anyone can answer.
Well, do you hear me? Yeah. Okay, so there is a phrase by Virginia Woolf when she says, when you don't know what's right or what's wrong, just touch your pulse, and you will see when it beats hard, it means that's something right, And often in these moments of conflicts, when they're very unjust, and you feel that your men are doing something wrong, and you feel that your government is doing something wrong. At that point, the rebellion, you stop in front of your men, you try to stop them. And this is the whole movement of women in black. The original principle, pacifist, I was talking about yesterday, is that first of all, you stand against your own who run a military politics, and by drafting and killing whomever, the neighbors, drafting them into the war. And this is the real opposition where it starts, because the sense of justice, and it's not about law. You will change the law. The Greek dramas written about that. Women who refuse, Antigone. Antigone. It's women who refuse to obey the law. And these who are the last will be the first in order when it comes to making a new society based on this what we lost and also. I mean, many marriages have fallen apart in my country because of this thing, because the women did not support their men who went to fight the war. And if you allow me, I will just tell you a true episode, which was like Croatia and Serbia, bordering countries. They were fighting the war, and they were like villages, like couple of kilometers away from each other. Every morning, men would go, take the arms, and go to the front line in order to, bomb, kill, whatever. And on the other side too. Instead, women who had on one side, there was no electricity, on the other side, there was no water. What they did would go to the same front line, and exchange, attach washing machines, exchange electricity and water. And while the men were throwing bombs over their head and exchange food. I have photos of that, you see? And then in the evening, the man would come and they would say, what do I have to eat, And they would say, oh, yeah, we have food. And they would say, where did you get it? And he said, forget it. Because she would get it from the enemy, This is, sorry, I don't want to speak.
Any other question, please? Yeah, please. And for whom? Just mention that, please.
So, Barkha ma'am mentioned that men and women report war differently, and you're all writers and journalists. Do you have any examples, or do you agree or disagree with that?
You take it.
One thing I have seen, that women always speak for peace. Even those who may be involved in conflict always speak for peace, and men don't necessarily do that.
Can I just answer? Now, this is just my experience as a reporter. And when I joined reporting, that was way back in 1971. And Barkha's mother, Prabha, was my first chief reporter. Now, when you talk about how do women look at not only war, but any situation differently, without sounding, as if I'm trying to label those women who came along with me or being arrogant, but I think we introduced in journalism what we called human stories. The women actually get the credit, the women reporters. What the men were doing they were very factual in what they were reporting, but always the human angle was missing. We started to do a lot of stories which gave you real-time stories about what men, women, and children were actually facing in a situation. Even it was a simple crime story. Suppose there was a fire. The men would just talk about fire broke out in this place and so many died. But we would go out of our way to talk to the women who had been, impacted by the fire, or what happened, where did the next meal come from. So I think women reporters, whether it's a conflict zone or any zone, should be credited for adding the human interest element to news stories. Thank you.
I'll just add a sentence to that. From my own experience reporting the war in 1999, a lot of male reportage was based on hardware. How was the Bofors gun doing? Were multi-barrel rocket launchers doing their job? Was ammunition going to run out? How many bodies had been buried? I'm not saying these stories are not important, and I did them as well. But nobody actually individualized the soldier to convert the soldier from a statistic to a person. And I think similarly in other conflict zones, I think women are more willing and open-minded about different sides of a story. I think men do go with a more fixed notion. So I do think that humanizing element is a very important element. I also think women reporters are not looking to appear macho, and I think male reporters, like you've seen them even on TV, everybody wants to, yeah, right, everybody's laughing, so you all know who I mean. But there's this arrogant need to be tougher than the next guy. I think women are okay being vulnerable, and in showing our vulnerability, I do think we draw that same vulnerability from other people, and that's where the best stories are.
Okay, two more questions because they're saying their time is up. Yeah, okay.
Good afternoon to all of you. I just had a question for the entire panel. We speak about women in conflict zones, the impact of them. Irom Sharmila, what happened to her? She took the fast for 10 years and after that went political with it, and she was crucified for that. I want to know your understanding of how the public or the people involved in the movement who went back to say that, no, this is not the way that we expected you to end the battle or continue the battle. I just wanted you to tell me.
Okay, one of you will just answer, but very short answer because they're saying their time is up. Okay, just 1 minute. We just take one more question.
I think we have to be a little more tolerant as a people as a whole, as a world as a whole, to allow people to make their own choices. If Iram Sharmila decided that is the way forward for me, then we must learn to accept it. If we don't like her way, let's find our own way. But why should we be pointing fingers at her choice?
Okay, the last question.
Okay, my question is not regarding the political aspect or the conflict zone, but from a woman's perspective, for a woman who's lived in a conflict zone and say they are being transformed to another zone, a safer zone, what is the biggest challenge a woman goes through from being in a conflict zone to have come to a safer zone?
I didn't get the question. If she's shifted from a conflict zone
To a safer zone,
When they come from
just a minute answer.
from one conflict zone to... Oh, what is the biggest? Oh, it's a great experience. I know that I learned a lot. I never knew. I must say that war is for women. There's no peace for women. There are very similar. There are big similarities for women in war and in peace. But there is one thing that is, I would say, positive for women who live in the conflict zones during the break of a social structure, is that they take power. They learn that they have power. They start to respect their opinions, because it happened in all wars, in the Second World War. And then when they come back to peace or go to other places in peace, they all of a sudden realize that they don't want to go back. They learn something and they want to keep their power. So it can be very empowering, the situation, if they survive, of course.
Okay, I'm sorry we can't take more questions because there's no time. But thank you for being there. Thank you.